speaker today is Jason Pye from the Due Process Institute. The Due Process Institute is a bipartisan nonprofit that works to honor, preserve, and restore principles of fairness in the criminal legal system. Jason Pye is the director of Rule of Law Initiatives at DPI, and his views on criminal legal reform are formed by his own life experiences, his advocacy work that he's done, and his libertarian and classical liberal views. And I hope we'll be able to hear about all of these things today. Prior to joining DPI, Jason served as the Vice President of Legislative Affairs at FreedomWorks. Please join me in welcoming Jason.
So this is actually really funny. I have my way of breaking the ice. I usually like to tell jokes and stupid stories, so I'm going to start with a stupid story. 1995 Peach Bowl. I'm a Georgia Bulldogs fan, in case anybody hasn't noticed. I'm from Metro Atlanta. 1995 Peach Bowl was University of Georgia versus the University of Virginia. December 30th, 1995. 15 years old. I'm almost 43 now, so this has been a while. I'm old enough to be some of you guys' father, which is like a weird thought. So Virginia comes out on the field, and they say, like Sherman through the South. And I was sitting there saying, you guys were part of the Confederacy too. And that has always stuck with me. And for some reason, I know it's a strange story, but it has always stuck with me for some reason. I also find irony in the fact that my girlfriend is a Virginia Tech grad, and here I am, a Georgia Bulldogs fan, speaking at UVA. Sadly, she couldn't make it with me today, but she wanted to be here. I'll have to tell her it's available online. Connor mentioned libertarian. I have basically lived my life as a libertarian. Being invited to speak to FedSoc is a huge privilege and honor, and I really appreciate the invite, especially as it relates to this very important subject, which has really shaped my public policy career, which I didn't expect, but here we are. So I was asked to talk about the conservative case for criminal justice reform, and I'm going to get to that. I'm starting here. But a lot of what formed the case for criminal justice has actually been done in conservative states like Texas, Georgia, again, being from Georgia, under Governor Nathan Deal, as well as other states like South Carolina. Mississippi's done a little bit. Alabama's done a little bit. All told, I think we're at 36 states that have done something on criminal justice reform to varying degrees. But from my approach on public policy broadly is to start at a point of empathy. But especially in criminal justice, because you have to have an empathetic frame of mind to be able to start talking about these issues with people. Unfortunately, we have a severe lack of empathy in public policy discussion across the board. It doesn't matter whether it's criminal justice, healthcare, immigration, it's severely lacking. How many of you don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to, but just a show of hands, if you can, if you feel comfortable doing so. How many of you know someone who's addicted to something? Drugs, alcohol? My uncle is a recovering addict. I hope he wouldn't, I know this is going to be public, I don't plan on sending this to him, but I know he relapsed in December of 2021 on heroin. He's fine, he's been clean again for the past more than a year and a half. He's doing well. He actually just came and visited me not too long ago. But for many who deal in drugs, traffic drugs, it's a way to supplement their addiction. It's a way to feed their addiction. And the spike in drug usage during the pandemic, for Trey, by the way, this is Trey Brown from the Due Process Institute. I had stuck Trey on a project that I haven't checked on in about 3 months to see where he is on it. But we were tracking drug usage. There's a survey that comes out from SAMHSA. It's I think National Institutes for Health, and they do the survey basically finding out how many people had tried drugs in the previous year or over their lifetime. We saw a substantial spike in 2020 into 2021. Isolation has a tendency to do that. Sending people to prison who have unaddressed addiction issues and mental health issues is fundamentally wrong. Now, if they commit violent crimes, repeat offenses, we should have a conversation about how to punish those people and the appropriate way to punish them. That could include incarceration, probably will include But sending people to prison who have these untreated issues, if you walk down the street of any major city in the United States, if you see homeless people on the street, chances are there's an unaddressed mental health issue there, or an unaddressed drug addiction issue. Punishment should fit the crime. Kind of goes with the previous one. First-time nonviolent offenders shouldn't receive long mandatory prison sentences. Lengthy periods of incarceration should be reserved primarily for repeat and violent offenders. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, at least touch on it. How many are you familiar with the crack cocaine sentencing disparity? Okay. So 1986, Congress passes the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, creates a sentencing disparity of 100 to 1. So 5 grams of crack cocaine got the same 5-year mandatory minimum prison sentence as 500 grams of powdered cocaine. That's how it lasted until 2010 when Congress passed the Fair Sentencing Act. Then they lowered the disparity to 18 to 1. It was still a disparity, just not as bad. So now it's 28 grams, gets you 5 years in prison. We're trying to get rid of that, but there's no chemical difference between the two. There's just not. It's the way it's ingested. That might be one thing. That's one argument that's been made. But even the Sentencing Commission has told us that it's not more addictive. It doesn't necessarily make it more addictive. Friends at FedSoc might like this one. Return judicial discretion to the extent practical. We hear a lot about leftist judges. That's fine. Mandatory minimums are big government in the courtroom. There's no other way to put it. Reduce cost to the extent practical. We're having this really fascinating fight over government spending right now. I gotta admit, it's hilarious to me. And because I follow this stuff, I'm a nerd. I'm a nerd. This is what I do. I work on criminal justice, and Trey can attest to this, that like I spend every Thursday and Friday putting together a newsletter that talks about what's happening in Congress on a variety of issues. So I'm watching this fight over 27% of government spending. That is what Congress is currently arguing about. 27% of government spending. It's discretionary spending. It's the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life. They're ignoring the other 73% of spending that is on autopilot. That is mandatory spending and interest on the debt. That will crowd out discretionary spending going from 6.6% to 5.6% in the next 10 years. Discretionary spending is declining while mandatory spending goes out of control. What happens when discretionary spending declines? That means less and less money is going to be available for Congress to spend on things like public safety. DOJ gets its budget through discretionary spending. 25% of that budget goes to BOP, Bureau of Prisons. Got to find other ways to deal with this problem. Focus on second chances. I'll be the first person to admit that I'm not someone of faith. But for those of you who are, this is really where you come in. And if you care about this issue, if you're not talking about it from your faith perspective, you're missing an opportunity. Because there are way too many people, on the right in particular, who talk about their faith, but seem to miss this when talking about crime. Accountability. In Georgia, we created drug courts. For those of you who are familiar with drug courts, it's basically just a separate court for people who commit low-level nonviolent offenses, particularly first-time offenses. They go through, they complete, they graduate, and they can move on with their lives as long as they don't commit another offense. In Georgia, we call them accountability courts. At the federal level, we focus on accountability by basically saying that, okay, you complete the terms of your sentence, you don't commit a new offense. We will help you we will provide some sort of path forward for you in society. And I'll come back to a lot of that later as we go on here. Let's see. Before the First Step Act, so I started working as a lobbyist, I guess technically in 2016, but I did criminal justice work 2 years prior to that. I started at FreedomWorks in September of 2014 and left there at the end of February 2021. If anybody wants to know that story, it's fascinating, has nothing to do with criminal justice. But we saw a lot of some criminal justice reform work take place before the First Step Act. You have the Prison Rate Elimination Act, which still exists today. The Second Chance Act, the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. This is a program that exists in the Commerce, Justice, and Science appropriations bills. You have to basically control F search to find it, but it's funded anywhere between 25 and 40 million, give or take the year. And then the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which I've already mentioned. The First Step Act was 5 years in the making. This is sort of the crux of really what I want to talk about, because there's a lot people talk about the First Step Act and they often don't know what the hell they're talking about. Before we had the First Step Act, we had a series. If I move away from the mic, is the camera going to still pick me up?
I think so, as long as you don't go too far.
Okay, I will stay here then. So I mentioned the Smarter Sentencing Act, or excuse me, the Fair Sentencing Act. We continued that through a bill called the Smarter Sentencing Act. It was basically like the next logical step. That was Senators Dick Durbin and Mike Lee, who is, I believe, a FedSoc member. That bill was approved Senate Judiciary Committee March 2014. It did not go to the floor for a vote. The majority leader at the time was Harry Reid. Criminal justice was largely not on the radar as a big issue at the time, and Democrats' control of the chamber was very much threatened. In fact, they would go on to lose it later that year. There was also another bill called the Recidivism Reduction and Public Safety Act, another bipartisan pairing at Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, and John Cornyn from Texas. That was also approved by Senate Judiciary Committee. Did not get a floor vote. It was reintroduced under another short title. For those of you who don't know, this short title is like the Recidivism Reduction and Public Safety Act. There's a longer title that I never use. So that died both in 2015 and 2017. The End of Sentencing Reform Act. This one, so these next two bills were actually part of a package that then Speaker Ryan was pushing through, and I was very actively involved in this. We were trying to get enough Republican support to move the bills. In September, October of 2016, we had marked up Sentencing Reform Act, Corrections and Recidivism Reduction Act, as well as a few other bills. And we were hoping to get some floor activity. Ryan brought the bills to the conference, and for those of you who don't know this, there's something called the Hassert Rule. It's not an official rule of the House Republican Conference or the House of Representatives, but it's an unofficial rule that basically says if the majority of the majority isn't on board, the bill doesn't. So a majority of the majority wasn't on board. And I remember getting the phone call that they were not going to remove the bills right before I was getting on a plane to go see a music festival in Chicago. And that might have been the most down I've ever been, because I had worked on that very hard. And that's ultimately, it was a life lesson or a professional life lesson, is to not take things personally when things don't work out. Next up is the Corrections Act. This is the successor bill to the Recidivism Reduction and Public Safety Act. Excuse me. And then finally, the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act, which took elements of the Smarter Sentencing Act, the Corrections Act, married them together, and was supported by Chuck Grassley and Mike Lee and Tim Scott and Dick Durbin, Cory Booker, along with many others. Got marked up 2 consecutive Congresses, ultimately didn't move. But it did get folded. Parts of the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act became the First Step Act. And I'll explain more about that. But before I go on, I want to hawk a couple things. So first of all, not hawk, but promote. There's a book that just got released by Colleen Aaron. It's it's up there. First Step Act, Reform in the Movement to End Mass Incarceration. I'm quoted several times in this book. I'm not saying that, I'm not promoting it because of that, but it gives a good history on the First Step Act, how we got there. It's a lot of quotes from a lot of different people. Van Jones, I believe, is quoted in here. A lot of my friends on the conservative side are quoted in here. It gives a really good overview. If you're interested, you can get it on Amazon. I don't know how much it is. She gave me a free copy, so and mine signed. So, and then I'll also have a piece coming out sometime next year. I don't have a date yet. I believe in the spring. The piece is entitled "Criminal Justice Has Been and Must Remain Bipartisan to See Success." That will be published by Columbia University, and that piece, 2,500 words, give or take, just also sort of documenting the history of First Step and the importance of criminal justice to remain a bipartisan issue. I also brought my official copy of the First Step Act, which, when you help pass a bill, you get a prize at the end of it. This is, my girlfriend made very clear she wanted this displayed in our living room, so she was upset that I took it down this morning to bring it here. But like I said, this is not the only bill I've ever worked on that became law, but it's the one I'm the most proud of, because 30,000 people have been released or sentenced under the First Step Act. I worked on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 as well, and everybody in DC was working on this, but only a handful of us were working on that, and it just meant more. So what was in the First Step Act? These are the different titles, and I'm going to get into a couple of the specific ones. You may have heard me see Title V has mentioned Second Chance Act. We reauthorized that. It hadn't been reauthorized since initial passage. So that was the cost of doing business to get Senator Portman on board, who was a great partner. So just kind of a quick overview of that. Recidivism reduction. How many of you have been told that the First Step Act released violent criminals on the streets? Has anybody heard that? You heard that. So what the First Step Act did, and this is probably this gets into the weeds a little bit, but every person in federal prison is required to go under a risk assessment. The risk assessment got released. It's called Pattern. It's publicly available. You can go look at it. And every person got ranked as minimal, low, medium, or high. And that's their risk of recidivism. And they also go through periodic reassessments. Individuals can earn time credits that they can cash in by completing programming or productive activities for placement into pre-release custody or supervised release. And there are some more details of that in terms of how much they can earn. I think there's a couple misconceptions about one particular aspect of the First Step Act. I mentioned that First Step created the earned time credit. There was already a time credit that existed in federal law. It's called good time credit. What we did in First Step Act was restore congressional intent. Given that you're all good law students, I'm sure you've heard of the Chevron deference. So the Bureau of Prisons had their own interpretation of what 52 days meant, or 54 days meant, excuse me, under, it literally, I don't know how they did it. The Chevron deference is a hell of a thing. It literally says 54 days in statute. Like, this is not up for debate. It says that in black and white. But they somehow interpreted that to be 47 days. I mean, it makes no sense. But they used Chevron and went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld their interpretation. I don't get it. So we fixed it. We restored congressional intent. And people who had been denied those 7 days of good time credit got them back where they were deserved it. If they had been serving good conduct and earned that time, they got it back. This is one of two provisions in the law that were applied retroactively. The other one I'm getting to, sentencing reform. So there were 4 sentencing reform provisions. All 4 of these came in some respect from other bills that existed. Smarter Sentencing Act, Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act. So we reduced 3-strike sentencing enhancements for prior drug offenses. So instead of 20 years, you get 15 for the second offense. Instead of life for the third offense, you get 25 years. I'm telling you right now, you don't need 25 years in prison to know that you don't want to go back. We reduced the limit for consideration of prior offenses to 15 years. That was a change that sort of balanced it. We also expanded the definition to include serious violent felonies. It was prospective only. Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act would have made it retroactive. We just did prospective. We broadened the safety valve exception to mandatory minimums. Under the previous law, you basically had to have very, very little, like 1 or 2 criminal history points, I think it's where it would apply, to no criminal history points. We expanded this to go up to 4 with exceptions for 3-point. You can't have a single 3-point offense or a 2-point violent offense. How many of you have heard of Weldon Angelos by any chance? Anybody? So Weldon Angelos, you can Google him. His case is really interesting. He was a guy who did, and Mike Lee talks about him a lot too. And this pertains to Section 403, the 924C stacking provision. So Weldon had committed 3 drug sales. I think that they said it was trafficking. It didn't seem like the amounts fell into trafficking. But where they got him was that he had a firearm either on his person or accessible when he did each of these 3 sales. 924C includes sentencing enhancements that will give you additional time if you have a firearm in your possession. There's stricter penalties for brandishing or discharging, but for just possession, first offense, 5 years. Each additional offense is 25 years, and they can be stacked. Weldon would have gotten about 10 to 12 years, I think, for the actual drug offenses. He got 55 for just having a gun in his possession on a single indictment, first-time offender. So we fixed that in 924C. A prior conviction has to be completed before you can move on with another 924C charge. And then, as I mentioned, retroactivity of the Fair Sentencing Act. We made that blanket retroactive for people who were sentenced under the old regime who were not given relief under the First Step Act, or excuse me, under the Fair Sentencing Act when it first went through, because it was only current and future cases. Goes back also to the violent offenses thing. As of January 2023, this is according to a DOJ report that was released in April, nearly 30,000 people have received relief under the provisions of the First Step Act. The recidivism rate thus far, and we'll concede here, we need more time and data to really determine the long-term success. But so far, it's a 12.4 recidivism rate, 12.4% recidivism rate. Anything under 40 is good. That's phenomenal. Now, again, more time, more data is needed, but that's good. The comparison cohort, the recidivism rate was just under 20%. And those were people who did not benefit at all from First Step. The recidivism rate for minimal and low risk, 5.4% and 15.4%. And minimum risk of recidivism, those individuals were 60% of all First Step Act beneficiaries. One of the provisions also, I mentioned this casually in a note earlier, I don't know if anybody caught it. We excluded a number of provisions in the First Step Act from earned time credits. Good time still applied, but earned time. There were more than 60 offenses that you could not get time credit or earned time credit. So that meant that almost 43% of people who are currently in Bureau of Prisons, or who were in Bureau of Prisons custody at the time this report came out, were not eligible for earned time credits. They could do the programming, they just couldn't benefit from the time credits. Building on the First Step Act, because one of the things I hear a lot from people is, when are we going to get a Second Step Act? Since the First Step Act was passed, we've had limited success on criminal justice. I think the couple things that passed, the Fair Chance Act was included in the National Defense Authorization Act, I think at the end of 2019 or for fiscal 19 or fiscal 20. And then we had the expansion of Pell Grants to so prisoners who are currently in prison could apply and get Pell Grants. These are the bills, and I know I'm leaving stuff off, but these are the bills that I've spent most of my time on in the past 9 months since the beginning of the new Congress. The Equal Act eliminates the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. The Terry Technical Correction Act, this one's a little weird. This relates to a Supreme Court case that came through in 2021, that dealt with the application of the Fair Sentencing Act. This individual was not sentenced under the specific statutes that triggered the sentencing disparity. So we're addressing it to make him eligible, as well as many others eligible. It's hard to explain, and I didn't bring notes about that with me, I'm sorry. Prohibiting punishment of acquitted conduct act. Given that you're all good law students, how many of you know that you could still get a penalty or still get a lengthier sentence based on crime for which you were with second chances, these are expungement and record sealing proposals. Kenneth P. Thompson Begin Again Act, there's an age restriction currently in law for the only expungement statute for drug possession. This gets rid of the age restriction. Clean Slate Act, pretty broad. It deals with record sealing. Has one section of the bill is for marijuana-related offenses, including trafficking, given that marijuana is now widely accepted. I should stop here to note that I'm a horrible libertarian. I don't smoke weed. It smells so bad. I drink a lot, but not. But it also has a provision that deals with non-violent offenses as well, with some exceptions. Fresh Start Act, it would provide grants to states to pursue automatic record sealing or expungement laws. And the HOPE Act basically is the same thing as Fresh Start Act. It's just limited to marijuana. Federal Prison Oversight Act, I don't know if anybody follows the news as closely as I do, or even heard about this stuff, but there have been a number of reports, Florida, California, of prison guards who are raping or sexually assaulting female inmates, in addition to other examples of corruption inside of the Bureau of Prisons, as well as this would create an ombudsman who would field those complaints from family members, prisoners, family members, representatives, so on and so forth, and determine whether investigation is warranted. And then other bills, civil asset forfeiture, this is the FAIR Act. This is the FAIR Act, reform federal civil asset forfeiture laws. The TEST Act, which is the only partisan bill that I'm mentioning here. This is a Booker bill, Senator Booker. There's been a lot of concern over fentanyl. The approach that the House Republican Conference has taken is like a bludgeon that I think is one of the worst approaches to a public policy issue I've seen since the Patriot Act. Would you guys want me to explain that a little bit more? I'm happy to. So the reason I say it's one of the worst public policy approaches I've seen since the Patriot Act is because there are thousands of potential chemical substances that are considered fentanyl-related substances. We've identified about 40 of them. And what we know about those 40 is that not all of them are harmful. There's one, according to recent administration testimony, is as harmful as water. There's another one that could even be used to reverse opioid and fentanyl overdoses. It has effects very similar to naloxone. But under the HALT Fentanyl Act, which is the House Republican bill, all substances that are FRS would be class-wide banned based on their chemical structure. That is a stupid approach. There is no off-ramp. So if we were to identify a substance that actually has some medical or public health benefit or other benefit, there's no way to bring it off, except for a vote of Congress. The TEST Act would temporarily continue and all these substances are currently temporarily class-wide banned. So we would continue that for another 2 or 3 years, I think it's 3. Provide some grant money to public health institutes to research these substances, and as we learn more about them and any harm they may cause or benefit they might have, allow the relevant public health authorities to deschedule or reschedule FRS based on their addictive properties, harm they may cause, or benefit them. And then finally, Driving for Opportunity Act would provide grants to states to I haven't worked on this one a ton, to basically end state practices for using fines and fees to hold someone's driver's license. So if your license is suspended, you want to get it back, you have to pay a fine to get it back. This would basically end that practice. Let's see. And why second chances are so important. Going back to, this is the one that I think really means a lot to me. And the reason it means a lot to me, I know my dad died when I was 12 years old. He's a Vietnam vet, he was exposed to Agent Orange. I grew up in a very lower middle class home. And I could have very easily made mistakes. I mentioned before my uncle's a recovering drug addict. His uncle was a recovering alcoholic. I got into two things, punk rock and politics. Punk rock didn't work out so well, so I kept pursuing politics. I know my life. If I just, one mistake could have changed my life. It still won't, because mistake could still change my life. Change any one of your lives. Wrong place, wrong time, whatever the case may be. So, but this is important from an economic perspective. What drives an economy? Anybody want to take a guess? Production. I always love when there's an economic downturn, the Keynesian response. We got to drive aggregate demand. We've got to prime the pump. We've got to spend more money. Production. Production is what drives an economy. July 2023, there were 8.8 million job openings. There were 5.8 million people looking for work. We don't have enough workers to fill the jobs. Deaths in the United States will outpace births in 2043. We'll have more people dying than being born. The only increase in population growth will come from net immigration. The unemployment rate for people who have served time in prison, this comes from a Bureau of Justice Statistics study, is 60%. That's at a minimum. At any given time, a maximum of 40% were employed. But we know expungement and record sealing laws have had a positive effect where they've been done. There's one particular study from University of Michigan Law School. You had individuals whose records were expunged saw yearly wage gains of nearly $4,300 for men and nearly $4,600 for women. Wage gains were far greater than job training programs. You can see the statistics to see the difference. I don't need to read it out for you. One fascinating point, though, from this study and the conclusions of it is that people who were beneficiaries of expungement were less likely to commit a crime than the general population. And you can see the overall recidivism rate was 4.2%, and less than 1% of the people who got their records expunged committed a violent crime. So I mentioned 12.4% being a good, amazing recidivism rate. That's phenomenal. So I'm gonna, shut up and answer questions. I'm happy to answer questions about everything up to and including how my Atlanta Braves are gonna win the World Series and how the Georgia Bulldogs are gonna three-peat. So ask away. Or if you don't have a question, just shoot me an email. I'll eventually respond to you at some point. You can ask Connor. I was super not responsive the first couple times we emailed.
Yeah, so how significant an obstacle is it as a criminal justice reform advocate to working with Republicans that any Republican that makes too strong a showing on criminal justice reform risks getting labeled not tough enough on crime in a primary?
It's a problem. The way I've used this analogy a few times this year when trying to get pep talks on criminal justice is that I view the landscape of criminal justice with Republicans very much like the landscape of the founding of the country, the Revolutionary War. You had a third of the colonists didn't care. You had a third who were Tories and a third who were patriots. The House Republican Conference and Senate Republican Conferences are very much the same. You have a third who are adamantly opposed to what we want to do. And often to the extent that they will lie through their teeth to make their point. You have a third who are strong allies, some on certain issues, and you have a third who don't care. That's kind of how it is. The problem is, with the pandemic, you saw increases in crime. The increases in crime are really a fascinating conversation because nobody talks about the causes. We still don't know what caused the crime decline in the 90s. The best estimate is 25% can be linked back to incarceration. So you have 75% of the decrease in crime coming from other factors. Nobody wants to talk about that. But if you listen to Tom Cotton, who's a moron, he hates libertarians, by the way. It's like the guy, he doesn't even think the Fourth Amendment should exist. I truly don't understand why anybody gave him power. It becomes very difficult to when you have that backdrop behind you. But you also have to put crime in context. We had increases in social isolation during the pandemic, especially early on, which has, by the way, put a great emphasis on mental health. I'm not afraid to admit that I deal with mental health issues. I have anxiety disorder. I've dealt with chronic depression all my life. I have no problem talking about it. I don't think that's a subject that we've given too much stigma to that we should really destigmatize. I just love seeing the memes normalize conversations about mental health. So we saw increased abuse of substances, alcohol, drugs. I mean, the first 6 months, I started drinking more red wine than I was ever used to. Then I started drinking more IPAs, and then I stopped drinking. Not because of alcoholism, it was just more of like, I couldn't fit in my suits anymore. I gained the COVID-19, as it were. And we've had like severe racial unrest that none of us have experienced in our entire lives. For good reason. That too many of us haven't taken the time to understand, let alone, I mean, can you imagine Jim Jordan wanting to sit down and think about why people are pissed off and protesting in the streets? No, it's Antifa. No. It's because we treat a class of people entirely different than anybody else. And then political violence that we haven't seen in our lifetimes. Did anybody think that the storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2021 we were gonna live to see something like that? I didn't. Which is why I'll never vote for Donald Trump. Next question. Yeah.
Kind of in the inverse, when you've been working with your folks on the left on prison reform, have you ever found any pushback from like maybe the abolitionist camp that your reforms don't go far enough?
Initially we did get some, so I'll speak in context of First Step and then move forward to more towards your question. So First Step, when it passed initially, it was May 22nd, 2018, is when the initial bill passed the House, and it was only a prison reform bill at the time. So if you go back and look at the vote for that day, I think I had 2 or 3 bills on the floor that day, First Step being one of them. We lost, I forget how many Democrats we lost, but it was not enough to affect the outcome, but it was enough to take notice of. We only lost 2 Republicans, and one of them we knew we were never going to get. And then the other one kind of surprised us because nobody saw that coming. But it wasn't a big deal. So more towards your specific question. No, I don't think we got any pushback from the abolitionist camp. Granted, I don't go out of my way to every member of Congress, even Tom Cotton, is put there by their constituents. So I'm not trying to diminish that role they have. There are some offices and members who you have to work with because they're the key to getting something advanced, and others who are noise in the background. I will work with any member of Congress, Republican or Democrat, who wants to advance good policy on criminal justice. I don't care who it is. Everything else is just messaging. And at this stage of my career, in this stage of my life, where the view I have of politics these days, if you're not trying to advance something and you're just up there messaging, you're not it's not worth the time. I hope that answers your question. What else? Yeah.
What would be your ideal criminal justice reform if you had perfect power of persuasion and you could get something through the next 10 years? Like, what would be the ideal vision?
Man, I think, I'll be honest with you, you'd probably have to tear it down and start all over again. And the reason I say that, you start at why do we punish people? We don't want them to commit new crimes, right? It's the deterrence. The way our criminal justice system functions, at least at the federal level and as well as most states, the way it functions is it's deterrence by providing you with the harshest possible environment you can imagine. And long prison sentences for conduct we deem that doesn't need long sentences. And certainly there are crimes against persons, for example, that need and require long prison sentences. I think we have to reshape our approach to how we punish people for crime, in that it has to be rehabilitative, particularly for people who are dealing with drug addiction. And we also have to focus on the root causes. And the root causes of crime are everything from lack of economic opportunity. I mean, I don't know where people are from, but I mean, eastern part of Kentucky, there's not a lot of economic opportunity there. Western part of the Commonwealth, there's not a lot of economic opportunity there. South Georgia, unless you're in the military, there's not a lot of opportunity there. So you have generational poverty, you have lack of education, which opens a conversation to things like school choice, which I'm very supportive of. It's a really deep question that, well, the answer to your question is very deep and complex. First thing first, I'd start over. Get rid of the current penal code or the current statutes we have on the books, and or at least go through them and see the ones that we actually need. We have 5,000 criminal statutes on the books. We have somewhere between 300,000 to 400,000 regulations that carry criminal penalties. How many of those are being used? I want to know. Is there not something, can the states not handle some of this stuff? I think it's a sort of bullshit answer to your question. It's such a loaded question that I've never given any thought to. Now I will spend the rest of my day thinking about this. I have no idea what you've done. Yes.
I thought it was a good question.
It's a great question. And I'm telling you right now, like my girlfriend, when I get home later, this is all she's gonna hear about.
When I talk to folks who are on the ground doing work in the States, particularly in the reentry space, that are also dealing with a lot more people thanks to the First Step Act, one of the things that's kind of like one of the loudest conversations that happens behind the scenes is around the Sex Offender Registration Notification Act. Right? Can't possibly pick a more politically unpopular topic, but I'm curious, since it would require movement at the federal level in order for the states to be able to have more control about how they would choose to deal with those harms, is there any conversation happening at the federal level, and what do you think it would take to get any movement on that issue?
The same it takes, well, first of all, no, I haven't heard of anything specific to the federal level. You're right, it is such the reason, it's the same thing with every issue. I mean, there's the lack of political will. Because you're branded as pro-sex offender.
Right.
I mean, it's the reason a lot of stuff doesn't get done. I'll do some digging around, because I'm curious.
Yeah.
And I do feel like I've seen some stuff on it, but you have a situation like what happened in Baltimore just the past week or so, where you had a guy who was a sex offender who hadn't checked in and ended up killing somebody. Politically inconvenient time to have conversations about an issue like that. So I'll do some digging around, I'm curious.
And it's an interesting movement at the court level of judges acknowledging that there's no evidence to prove any, credible, and there's no credible evidence about his efficacy, but still bound by federal law.
I mean, this kind of goes back, one of the things that goes back to your question a little bit. In the perfect world, the trial penalty being what it is, what is it, 98% of cases that are cleared are done on plea deals, something like that. 90% of people who come through the federal criminal justice system are represented by a public defender. doing something to, and I don't know how you do this. My boss, Shanna, is a real expert when it comes to stuff like this, because she's a lawyer and I'm not. Yeah, you guys invited a non-lawyer to speak for lawyers. I'm a lobbyist, for God's sake. We're worse than lawyers. Doing something about the trial penalty, because the way prosecutors hang lengthy sentences over the heads of the accused, you put them in a position where it's like, well, if I, they're saying I'll get 2 years of probation and go on the sex offender registry, even though I know I didn't commit the crime, or it was consensual, or whatever the case may be. You're putting these people in some weird, that's where otherwise they'll throw the book at them. They'll get 5 years in prison or whatever the case may be if they don't take the plea deal. I don't know how you address that, but fixing real problems like that would be something I would want to immediately tackle. Yeah. Yes, sir.
You talked about the purpose of punishment being deterrence. And I think for a lot of people, there's an alternative perspective where punishment also serves as a retributive function. It's about giving people their just desserts and also forming like a form of societal condemnation. And for people who do have that perspective of punishment, either in place of deterrence or perhaps maybe complementing it, what would your advice be to how they should think about criminal justice reform?
Yeah. So the thing that you mentioned, you commit a crime, we put you away for a period of time as as penalty for you committing the crime. In a lot of respects, a criminal record, even just an arrest, can be problematic when you're filling out job applications. If I got caught shoplifting when I was like 6 months after my dad died, and the security guard was kind enough not to refer me to juvenile. Thank you, sir. Had I been older, where that could have been something I did as an adult, that would have stuck with me for the rest of my life. If I had, served even probation or whatever the case may be. It was a very minor crime. I mean, I was 12. What do you think I was stealing? It's a pack of baseball cards. I was an idiot. But serving time in prison and the negative connotation that carries in our society, the stigma that it carries in our society. I go back to the economic side of this. You have essentially 6 out of 10 people who have served time in prison are currently unemployed. 6 out of 10. They have been removed from the workforce, that has lost productivity, that has lost output, that is a family that is potentially living on welfare. And it does nothing against people who have used benefits when I was growing up in a single parent household. Nothing against that. But the goal is to get people out of the system and off the system and into productive lives as taxpayers, as people who can contribute positively to our society, even people who have served in prison, especially people who have served in prison. If that is not the goal, well, if that's not part of the goal, the end step, I don't know what we're doing other than warehousing people and making sure they can't do anything for the rest of their lives. Yeah. Okay. One more question. Anybody? Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sort of interested in why you titled your talk "Conservative Justice Reform," criminal justice reform, when it seems like a lot of the bills are through bipartisan means. So, like, what tenets of this criminal justice reform would you say make it conservative, and how does that differ from like a liberal?
So, didn't you pick the title of the discussion? Yeah, that was Connor's. Very quickly throw Connor under the bus. I was talking to, I will answer your question, but me being the beat around the bush guy. I was having a conversation with someone on House Ways and Means the other day, as their coalitions person, checking in to, she reached out, checking in on anything I was working on. I was like, oh, I know, I got a bill. Eventually going to be reintroduced, bipartisan, referred to Ways and Means. Would love to see movement on it. And we made a joke about the current situation in Congress with government funding. And I was like, yeah, I'm just curious when you guys are going to start tackling entitlements, because we all know that's the real issue here. And crickets, of course. And I told her, she said that, that they hope to have a plan out soon. And I was like, well, I hope it's bipartisan, otherwise it's not going to have any credibility. To move anything in Congress, to have credibility, you has to have bipartisan support. When you have First Step Act, which was they're the four horsemen of the First Step Act: Chuck Grassley, Mike Lee, Dick Durbin, Cory Booker. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, 1 very conservative Republican from Utah, who I don't think anybody's going to sit here and call him a squish. That bill was based in conservative principles. There were conservative principles that, although I don't consider myself conservative, I share, because it was about restorative justice. It was about reducing costs. It was about getting people the means to at least start to get their lives back together. To pick up I have a really great op-ed for those of you who are interested. It ran on the Hill earlier this year. The congressman from Arizona, David Schweikert, he goes on the floor of the House and gives these awesome speeches about how we're basically screwed as a country because of our finances. They're not depressing at all. One of his speeches, he talked about this guy who participated in a work program inside of this prison where he was dealing with drug issues. He learned how to work on air conditioning units, got out of prison, got a job, and the guy has been doing great ever since. That is like the epitome of what we should want to see out of someone who goes to prison. Is that you paid your time, you paid your dues, the debt you owe to society. You have gotten out, you picked up a skill, oddly enough, in prison. You got out, and you're now contributing to society. That is really, really what we should strive for with our correction system. And that was my last question. I want a couple quick notes for those of you who care passionately about this issue. A lot of this stuff begins in the juvenile stage. There's a really great documentary called Kids for Cash. For those of you who haven't heard of it, this is dealing with this kickback scandal in Lucerne County, Pennsylvania. You want to talk about people who got exposed to the criminal justice system? Some of these kids learned how to become criminals while they were in the juvenile justice system in Lucerne County. And some of the stuff that's in there will make your blood boil. And if you don't cry, something's wrong. Thank you guys for your time.